Well, when I was a teenager, I loved listening to one particular Christian band, well, lots of them, but this one in particular called DC Talk. Now, it's a relatively narrow window I've got here. The people who are my age that were Christians will have heard of DC Talk. Hands up. We got one at the back. Now, the people who are younger than me and have become Christians will have not heard of DC Talk. So if you're younger than me and you've not heard of DC Talk, put your hands up. Yeah, there's a few. And then there's the people who are older than me who were not part of the whole music revolution thing, and they would have never heard of DC Talk either. So those who are older than me who've never heard of DC Talk, yeah, see, I knew this was going to be a problem. So Leah and I know what we're talking about here. The rest of you are all in the dark, and that's okay, because it's really just one of their songs on their second album. It began with a quote from someone, and the quote goes like this. I thought it was quite thought-provoking. It was helpful to me as a young person. The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And the thing is, so does Jesus. We all know how frustrating it is when someone says one thing but then lives a completely different way. When words and actions don't line up, it leaves you feeling like you've been sold some kind of counterfeit. And James here is very concerned with counterfeits. Not counterfeit money, but counterfeit Christians who have a counterfeit faith. A faith that looks impressive perhaps on the outside, but when put to the test, it turns out to be, and these are his words, not mine, worthless. That's what this whole section of James is about. You might remember that James signals new sections in the book, in this letter, by addressing the brothers and then giving a fresh command. Well, we saw back in verse 14, almost a new section. He says, what good is it, my brothers, new section, if someone has faith but does not have works? Which is actually a rhetorical question, not a command. And so it's actually marking here a moment of transition between two sections. The verses 14 to 17, they wrap up the last section about favoritism and love for the poor, but they also set the stage for what James is about to teach us here now. And James in his teaching couldn't be clearer. This is, in fact, one of the clearest statements of truth in the entire Bible. Because James doesn't just say it here once, he says it here 5 times across this section. Faith without works is dead. Now, the phrasing is not identical, but the main point remains the same. We see it in verse 14, we see it in verse 17, we see it in verse 20, verse 24, and verse 26. He's hammering home the same point. And yet it's so easy for us to get confused and to get this wrong. We have to make sure this morning that we get this right. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. Now that's our big idea this morning, so please let me say that again for you. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. We're going to unpack that by looking at 3 things this morning. Firstly, we're going to see faith lived out in theory, then we'll see faith lived out in practice, and finally then faith lived out in us. So let's begin with number 1, faith lived out in theory. Look with me at verses 18 and 19 of chapter 2. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Now, there is a little scholarly debate going on here in verse 18. Is the someone mentioned here an opponent of James, or is this some imaginary dialogue partner who actually agrees with James? In the Greek, there are no punctuation marks, so it's a bit tricky for us to understand what's going on. There's no quotation marks for us to look at here. But that's just, what you see in front of you is just our best guess as to where they should be. So what you have there is, you have faith, I have works, with quotations around that. You see that in the text in front of you? The question, are those where the quotation marks should be? It leaves us with a question about pronouns. It seems to imply a detractor who says to James, you, James, have faith, but I, which I suppose could be someone opposed to him, maybe a Pharisee or something, says, I have works. The problem with this is it would seem to be saying that you believe you are saved by faith, I believe that I'm saved by works. But then James steps in and says, no, you, the detractor, show me your faith apart from your works. But haven't they just said that they have works? You see how that's confusing? And I, James, will show you my faith by my works, which seems to be saying the exact opposite of what the quote just said. Do you see that? How the quote and the verse that follows seem to be saying exact opposites? So I think the sense here actually is that the quotation mark should cover the entire verse. So it should go from verse 18, but someone will say, quotation, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my works by my faith. End quotation. And what the person who's speaking is actually doing is agreeing with James and strengthening his point. It's tricky, but that's what I think is happening with the quotation. It's not a disagreement, it's an agreement. But ultimately, no matter what grammatical hoops you have to jump through, the point is actually still very clear and the same. You can claim to have faith all day long, but if it isn't visible in your works, how would anyone ever know? Faith, by definition, is invisible. It's trust in God lodged deep within your heart. The only way it can be shown is when it overflows into your life. Now, this then raises a second, more obvious and much more serious question. How do we reconcile this with the later teachings of Paul? You see, Paul, for example, in Romans 3:28 says, we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or Galatians 2:16, a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And yet James comes along and says here, and then look down in verse 24 as well, he says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So how do we hold these two teachings together? Do Paul and James simply disagree? Is this a contradiction in the Bible where we have to pick which one we prefer of the church fathers? No. The answer lies in how they are using that word justify. You see, Paul uses the word justify to mean declared righteous before God, but James uses it to mean shown to be righteous. So for Paul, justification is vertical between man and God. For James, it's horizontal before man and the watching world. Paul is fighting legalism. James is fighting hypocrisy. Same gospel, different battles. And that's the distinction between the two. Now, I take the kids to Y Connect in Liverpool every Friday. It's become a new habit in my life. I do this once a week on a Friday. This whole term we've been going into Liverpool, and I drop them off, and I've got a couple of hours to kill in the middle of Liverpool. And I do the only reasonable thing that anyone would do on a Friday night when they're stuck in Liverpool. Anyone? I go to Costco. Exactly. And so I wander around Costco. Now I have to let you know, guys, okay, this is important to realize. The appeal of spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds on massive things that you don't need, or lots and lots and lots of things that you don't need, it does wear off. I promise. So I've now reached the point where I can go in and I can walk and not even spend a penny. It's great. But here's what happens when you do buy something at Costco. You stand in the queue, which is now a really long queue because we're already into Christmas shopping at Costco. I know. But you stand in the queue, and when you get to the end of the queue, you pay your money for the goods that you have in your trolley, right? And so you pay for your items, and you have them in your trolley, and then you leave the store. Sounds like any other shopping experience. But at Costco, there is one extra step. And anyone who's been to Costco knows exactly what that is. As you get to the exit, there is a person standing there who asks to see something. What do they ask to see? Right, and they don't let you leave until they've seen your receipt, cross-checked the items on your receipt to what's in your trolley, and then made a mark on your receipt. Do you see what's happening there? Did you pay for the items when you showed the receipt? Were those items, in fact, already yours, already paid for? You were the legal, correct, right owner of all those items in your trolley, and yet, without that receipt, the person at the exit wouldn't let you leave the store. You don't pay for your items at the door, but you do prove that they are yours. The receipt proves that what's in the trolley is genuinely your item. In the same way, works are the receipt to go with faith. They don't purchase salvation, but they do prove that that faith is real, genuine, and yours. Well, James then presses his point home even harder in verse 19. You believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. This is a shot across the bow to anyone who thinks that faith is merely an intellectual argument. James is referencing the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. To confess this was at the very heart and core of the Jewish faith. But James says, even demons have orthodox theology. They know exactly who God is. And they shudder at the thought of his judgment. In fact, the highest Christology that you will find anywhere in all of the four Gospels doesn't come from the mouth of the disciples or from a scribe or from a religious leader. It comes from the mouths of demons. Mark's Gospel shows this vividly. The unclean spirit in Mark chapter 1, verse 24 cries out, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Mark chapter 3 and verse 11, they fall down before him and shout, You are the Son of God. Mark chapter 5, verse 7, the demon-possessed man says, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? A theologian, a commentator, Grant Osborne, puts it starkly. They realize who he is and quake with fear, knowing the certainty of the judgment is awaiting them. These foolish faith people should feel the same terror as the demons. For in reality, they stand indicted by God and are under judgment for their lack of good works. Now, at seminary, we had to read stacks and stacks of books written by scholars who studied the Bible more than most of us ever will in our lifetimes. Brilliant people, experts in Greek and Hebrew. And yet, for many of them, it's just literature. They are not saved. Why? Because they have no works flowing from faith. Their belief is not accompanied by trust, love, obedience, or good deeds. It's merely intellectual. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in miracles. They can write an essay on the resurrection, but they don't believe it really happened. Friends, that is demon-level faith. Accurate theology to a point, but no transformation. Knowing the right things, in theory, is not enough. So here's what James has to say for us. Faith without works is not saving faith. It's empty, hollow, lifeless. It's the kind of faith that the demons have. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But it's also clarifying. It sort of draws a line in the sand for us. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. That's point number one. Faith is lived out in theory. Moving on to number two, faith lived out in practice. You see, James moves on from the theory side of things onto some practical advice, from argument to illustration. He doesn't want us to simply grasp this in our heads. He wants us to see it and to see it lived out in the lives of God's people. And so he holds up two examples from Israel's history, Abraham and Rahab. And the contrast here couldn't be sharper. Abraham is the father of the nation, the patriarch, the friend of God. Rahab is a pagan, a prostitute, a citizen of Jericho. Yet, both of them show us the exact same truth. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. Let's look first then at Abraham. Tested faith. James begins Abraham in verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? Now, surely anyone who reads this must have alarm bells going off, don't we? Wait a minute. Was not Abraham justified by works? Didn't Paul make it clear in Romans 4 that Abraham was justified by faith? Paul quotes to us from Genesis chapter 15. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. For Paul, the emphasis is entirely on his faith, but James again is not contradicting Paul here. We're once again looking at two angles of the same thing. We're looking at one man, different perspectives. Genesis 15 comes decades before Genesis 22. In Genesis 15, God promises Abraham countless descendants, as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham is old, childless, and this promise seems, humanly speaking at least, impossible. Yet he believes God, and God takes him at his word. And friends, that is faith. Simple, trusting, hopeful faith. And God, therefore, counts it to him as righteousness. He has just gone to the checkout counter and had his goods paid for. But then, years later, in Genesis chapter 22, God puts Abraham's faith to the test. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 says this. After these things, God tested Abraham. The command of this test is almost unthinkable. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. I mean, what's going on here? God is not interested in child sacrifice. Far from it. He is testing Abraham's faith. The promise of Genesis 15 is tied up in his offspring, in Isaac becoming this great nation. To kill Isaac would be to kill the covenant, to cut the line of blessing. Will Abraham trust God even when it looks like God's promise is collapsing? Yes, Abraham does. He obeys. He takes Isaac up the mountain. He binds him. He raises the knife. And only then does God stop him, providing the ram in the thicket as a substitute. But the result of all this, you see, in Genesis chapter 22, it ends not only with relief for Abraham, but also with a restatement of the covenant promise. God reaffirms his covenant to them. He marks the receipt with a proof of purchase, if you will. Genesis 22, 16 and 17 says, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. Abraham's faith in Genesis 15 was real, but it was proven genuine in Genesis chapter 22. His faith was not merely professed, it was lived out. And that is what James is driving at in verses 22 and 23. You see that faith was active among his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. Now, I love the wordplay we find here in verse 22. A more literal reading that we might find where it says that faith was active along with his works. More literally, you could read that to say faith was working with his works. It's a really cool phrase. Faith and works in partnership together. Faith expressing itself through works. Works didn't replace faith. They revealed it. And the outcome? Abraham is called a friend of God. Now that's a title that's repeated to us in Scripture. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 7, it says, "Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend?" Or in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 8, where God is speaking to the nation, he says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, comma, my friend." That doesn't need to be there. There's no reason for God to include that other than to remind us that Abraham's faith, proven through testing, resulted in his all-time friendship with God. It's amazing. The God who flung the stars into space calls Abraham his friend. What greater honor could there be? And yet friendship with God is not built on empty confession, but on faith that trusts and faith that obeys. That's Abraham, tested faith. But then we get a second illustration of Rahab, risky faith, faith from the margins, if you will. You see, James could have stopped there. Abraham is a strong enough example. He is the obvious choice. Patriarch, covenant bearer, national hero. But James doesn't stop there. He turns to Rahab in verse 25. And in the same way, was not Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received messengers and sent them out another way? The contrast here is striking. Abraham was a man, Rahab a woman. Abraham, the father of a nation, Rahab a foreigner, a Canaanite. Abraham revered as a friend of God, Rahab stigmatized as a prostitute. Abraham's story unfolds in Genesis, the founding book of Israel's history. Rahab's story is sort of tucked away in Joshua chapter 2 on the edge of conquest. And yet James places them side by side here for us. Why? He does it to show that the principle at play is universal. Faith lived out is not just for patriarchs, for the good and for the great. It is for anyone who will trust God and prove that trust in action. Rahab had heard the stories of Israel's God, how he dried up the Red Sea, how he defeated kings before them. And then Israelite spies came to Jericho and she declared her faith openly in Joshua chapter 2, verse 11. She said, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." That's a confession of faith, straight from the lips of a pagan prostitute. But she didn't stop there with a verbal confession. She then acted on that faith. She hid the spies. She risked her life. She aligned herself with God's people. And in doing so, she was spared when Jericho fell. Not only spared, but then grafted into Israel. Even more, she's named in Matthew chapter 1 as part of the genealogy of Jesus. By faith lived out, Rahab the prostitute became Rahab the ancestor of Christ. That's the power of faith in practice. It shows us that salvation is not for the select few, but for anyone, the patriarch and, yes, the prostitute alike. And it shows us that faith is not abstract, but it is always embodied. Faith believes, yes, but then it must always act. Now, if we step back, what do Abraham and Rahab together teach us? Well, they teach us that faith lived out in practice is not confined to one type of person or one kind of circumstance. For Abraham, faith was lived out through testing, in moments of agonizing trial when obedience cost everything. For Rahab, faith was lived out through risk, in moments of danger when siding with God's people meant betraying her own. We can nod our head at James's theory above, yes. Faith is proven genuine when it's lived out, and we can agree with that. But then, we somehow expect that living out our faith would be easy. James immediately rejects that notion, because for both Abraham and Rahab, living out their faith would have been the hardest thing that they ever had to do in their lives. It's something that they both, and all believers, have to do. But it isn't easy. Which brings us to our third point about faith lived out in us. James doesn't leave us with theology and history alone. He presses right into our lives in verse 26. He gives us a summary image. He says, "For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead." It's a vivid picture. But notice how the Bible in front of you, there is a lowercase s in the word spirit. Do you see that? I think that's correct. The point James is making here is simple. A body without breath is a corpse. It's a body with a spirit, a body without a spirit, without a soul, without life. However fine the form, however healthy the limbs may appear, without the animating spirit, it's lifeless. So this isn't talking about the life-giving Holy Spirit here. He's just talking about bodies without spirit. And so James says, it's the same way with faith. Profession without practice, confession without obedience is a shell of faith. It looks like the real thing, but it has no life. And this is a genuine warning against counterfeit faith. But it's also a helpful and healthy reminder for genuine Christians to make sure that our lives reflect the faith that we confess. So how then do we live out our faith? How do we show that it is alive? Let's step back and remember what James has already taught us. His whole letter has been about showing us what living out faith looks like. Like Abraham, faith lived out in testing. When life tests us, or indeed if we think back to chapter 1, verse 3, when God tests us through illness, financial strain, relational tension, anxiety about the future, the question is whether we will trust God's promises or whether we will turn away. Abraham teaches us that genuine faith clings to God even when the testing cuts deep. Like Rahab, faith lived out in risk. When there's danger in owning Christ, whether that's ridicule in the workplace, hostility in society, rejection by friends, or certainly for many Christians around the world, real-life persecution. Genuine faith steps out anyway. Rahab aligned herself with God's people at great potential cost. So too, faith today may call us to stand firm when it's risky. And as James has shown us, faith is lived out in compassion. True religion, he says, is to visit the orphans and the widows in their distress, chapter 1, verse 27. In chapter 22, not to show partiality to the rich, but to honor the poor. Faith is lived out in how we respond to those in need, the hungry, the refugee, the marginalized. It is lived out in how we treat the least of these. And so put together, here's the picture that James is painting for us. Faith lived out in practice means trusting God in trials, obeying God in danger, and showing God's love to the needy. Now, there are quite a few films that, depending on the day of the week that you speak to me, I might describe as my favorite film of all time. But anyone who knows me can confirm that in my books, Jaws is right up there. Right? I love Jaws. And there's this one scene in Jaws, it's the 4th of July. And that's some kind of a holiday in America. I think it's got something to do with Will Smith defending the Earth against aliens. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's the midsummer and all the tourists have arrived on Amity Island. The beach is packed with holidaymakers. There's just one problem. No one is going into the water. There have already been several shark attacks at this point, and despite the fact that the beach is open, no one is willing to be the first person to get back into the water. And so Mayor Larry Vaughan is distraught, and he walks over to some prominent townsperson that he knows, and he says to him, "Why aren't you in the water?" The man responds, I just put on some suntan lotion and I'm trying to absorb the sun." Vaughan then answers, "Nobody's going in. Please get in the water." I mean, you can say that Amity doesn't have a shark problem as much as you want, but what people really believe is proven by whether or not you're willing to get in the water. And that's what James is saying here. We can shout from the rooftops, "I believe in Jesus. I believe he died and rose again. I believe he forgives my sins and makes me God's child." But if our actions never show it, do we really believe that? Let me ask you, what is it that's keeping you out of the water? What sharks are circling in your mind? Is it fear? Fear of rejection, fear of what people might say if you really live like a Christian? Is it circumstances, hardship, stress, ill health, job insecurity that make faith feel fragile? Is it inconvenience, the costliness of serving, giving to others, welcoming the stranger, loving the difficult? Is it shame? The label of Christian isn't necessarily seen as a good thing in our world right now. Could you be ashamed of publicly planting your flag on that hill? Or could it even be unbelief? It's true. I would rather watch TV than care for the poor. I would rather go for a walk than share the gospel. I would rather pay for a holiday than give to the church. The problem is, when you examine your heart, perhaps your works are starting to betray your lack of faith. James wants us to see that faith must swim. Faith that never leaves the sand isn't really faith. It's faith in name only. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. And that brings us back to James's repeated refrain 5 times, verse 26. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. 5 times he said variants of this because he knows how easily we get it wrong. He knows how readily we slip into faith of words without deeds, of lips without life. But dead faith is no faith at all. It was never actually alive to begin with. Just as a body without breath has no life, so faith without works has no reality. But here's the good news. When faith is alive, it brings us into a relationship with God himself. Remember how Abraham was called a friend of God? What a staggering title that he has that all of us can have too. To be a friend of the Most High, to walk with him, to know him, and to be known by him. That's the gift that Christ has won for us. And so Paul says in Romans 5:10 that we who were once enemies of God have been reconciled through the death of his Son. And so Jesus says to his disciples in John 15:15, I have called you friends. How do we become friends of God? Not by piling up the works, not by striving to impress him, but by trusting in Christ. He is the one who lived the perfect life of obedience, who passed every test, who risked everything in love, who bore our sin on the cross. And when we trust him, we are justified. The bill is paid at the checkout. We're made right with God, counted righteous, welcomed as his friends. And then as friends of God, that living faith begins to show. Works follow as fruit. Obedience grows as gratitude. Service follows from love, not to earn salvation, but to prove it genuine. James has been absolutely clear. Faith without works is dead, but faith proved genuine will be lived out. Faith lived out in theory. It's not enough to confess. Even the demons do that. Faith lived out in practice. Abraham and Rahab show us that faith acts in testing and in risk. Faith lived out in us. When it comes to our circumstances, our fears, our compassion for others, true faith swims. And so as we close, let's return to our big idea. Faith is proved genuine when it is lived out. The question then is your faith alive? Is it real? Is it more than words? Because Christ offers us more than words. He offers us life, forgiveness, friendship with God. Receive him, trust him, then live it out. Because genuine faith would never stay on the beach. Let's pray together.